having me. Thanks, Matt, for the introduction. One of my favorite introductions I've had. So you heard that I live in DC now, but I spent some time in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was out in Montana early on taking this job 7 years ago. Got to fly out to Montana, beautiful big sky country. And I was in outside Missoula, small town, and the guy said, "Look, I want to say, I'm going to say something about you. Tell me where you're from." And I said, "Well, I live in Washington, D.C. This was about 2009. He said, "Oof, D.C. Yeah, it's not great to be from D.C. these days around here. So where were you from before that?" And I said, "Well, I'm from California." And he said, "I'll just say you're from Washington, D.C. All right, my California joke. So I'm going to run through this presentation tonight, and we have a nice intimate crowd, and I definitely will encourage, till I say otherwise, any kind of questions and comments as we go, because we've got some time. And I think this subject is fascinating, and it is vitally important to, I believe, the economic success of your region here in Southwest Idaho. I got into transportation about 25 years ago, and I was working in it, and some people said, like, "How did you get into transportation?" And I didn't really know until I was looking at some old family photos, and this is my dad and my grandfather in the 1920s in England. Now, you won't know this either from my accent, but I was actually born and raised in England, near Manchester and Wigan and coal country. I came here when I was 10 years old. I worked really hard to lose my accent and get an American accent, so it's true. I'm bilingual. I speak English and American. Tonight, entirely American, only in American. But that's my dad, the little boy there, who took tickets on the bus, and that's my grandfather, whose father, my great-grandfather, worked in the coal mines and said, "I'm not having my kid work in a coal mine," so he saved enough money to buy a bus. Back in the 1920s, that became Corless Motor Services. And my dad fixed engines, became an engineer, went to Liverpool University, eventually brought my family over here in the 1970s. So public transit is in my blood. All right. But now I run this group, Transportation for America. We are not a trade organization. We're not a lobbying firm. We are really an alliance of local elected civic business leaders from around the country who really believe that we've got to think differently about how we approach transportation, how we make investments. I'm going to talk a lot tonight about federal transportation program. We're going to actually mention it a few times, not as much as I usually talk about it. State policy is really important. We've got a former state legislator, maybe others here, but we firmly believe that cities and suburbs and towns and regions like your own trying to figure this out, trying to figure out innovative solutions are really where the action is at. And those places that can figure out those solutions, those innovations fastest, will be the ones that succeed. We have a really interesting mix on our advisory board. We, again, believe in really kind of big tents and diverse coalitions, so everything from the Nashville Chamber, the Atlanta Chamber of Commerce, Kaiser Permanente, elected officials, the Urban League, the Atlanta Regional Commission, and on. And these are just some example of, again, the breadth, both geographically and the type of folks that we work with as our members. All right, 4 things tonight that I want to go over. I'm going to, as you can already tell from my family slide, I love the historical reference to all this stuff. So I'm going to cover a little bit about kind of how we got here. I want to talk a little bit again about the consumer preferences. What's happening out there that really is driving a demand for people to have more options. Not necessarily a demand for the traditional form of public transportation, but a demand for different mobility options. We're going to talk about some case studies, things that are happening around the country right now, right in this time, that are, I think, really important that we can learn from, and then what are those takeaways that we can take from that might be relevant here. Okay. All right. Speaking of innovations, what's this innovation right here? What's the big innovation? Rail, right? The muddy streets of the 1800s, and this is the horse-drawn omnibus, of course. Before we actually had streetcars and railroads, we had this, which is the rail in the streets that many of you may still even see in your city streets, because they are often still there, buried under the pavement. And of course, from there we did blossom into streetcars. And you probably all know, I bet you had a pretty robust system of streetcars. Just about every town in the United States, over 5,000 people, sometimes under, had streetcars. And connecting those towns were a series of interurban routes, right? If you ever see the old schedules, it's just phenomenal, the networks that we had. Now, I'm not one of those who believes we should bring back all those streetcars and just redo it like it used to be. But our history, I think, is really important in terms of understanding a couple of things. Number one, on streetcars, they were private. They were entirely private, okay? Developers largely had these streetcars and ran them. Why? To open up their land that they owned so that they could actually build these new developments, right? So it was actually, at that point, even a very cheap way of basically providing accessibility to land so they could develop those land, and those were then called the streetcar suburbs. Now, in many cities in America, those streetcar suburbs are like right close in, near downtown. You wouldn't even recognize them, but you'll see these commercial corridors. You'll see these really, they are some of the most valued and prized kinds of neighborhoods we have in our cities all across the United States because of the commercial, because of not just the commercial that grew up, but really the sort of the human scale, the neighborhood scale. This is where you got off the streetcar and you stopped in the shop and you walked back to your house. But again, these were almost entirely private for a long time. And then, of course, the other next innovation was the birth of the interstate freeways. In 1956, President Eisenhower signed the Interstate Highway Act. We actually already had a federal gasoline tax since the 1930s, but this was the act that basically put that federal gasoline tax into what they call the Highway Trust Fund. That is still actually a fund that still operates barely at the federal level because we're keeping it together with kind of duct tape and Band-Aid. More on that later. But this was a huge transformation in terms of building the interstate highways. And then, of course, we got rid of the streetcars. We tore them up. Some still exist, but very, very few. We sold them either to other countries or we basically put them on the scrap heap. And we said, hey, here's the next innovation is the bus, right? We're going to actually replace all the streetcars with buses. And that's fine, and I'm a huge fan of buses. But basically, we didn't actually provide the policy that it really took to make buses work effectively and efficiently in an urban, even suburban setting. And really, very importantly here, really cities began to take over these formerly private providers. So those streetcars kind of went out of business for a variety of reasons. The buses came in, and the beginning of the sort of the public agencies, the transit agencies, sort of started right around the beginning of the 1950s. So just again, really, I do think it's important to understand this stuff. The different phases we've kind of just touched on: the streetcar era, the end of the streetcars, and the post-World War II, 1950s, all around the same time that both the Interstate Highway Bill was signed. Frankly, a lot of the private railroads, long distance, were getting out of the passenger business. That resulted in Amtrak being formed in 1970 by the feds. First dedicated funding for mass transit not until 1982. And then you have this really interesting series of new rail investments called heavy rail, light rail. We're just talking about the Washington, D.C. subway. And if you think about the D.C. subway, San Francisco's BART and Atlanta's MARTA all look the same, right? They were all designed basically right around the same time. They came online through the same federal funding programs in the 1970s. That was sort of generation kind of 2.0 of these heavy rail regional subways, pretty capital intensive. Believe it or not, Detroit, Michigan was supposed to get one of those, and the funding was cut off, and they ended up with the People Mover. And then we kind of moved into the next generation of light rail, what we call light rail. So Salt Lake City, Denver, Sacramento, San Jose, Buffalo, a lot of these new systems, Baltimore, some quite successful, others not so much. And that was really the 80s and 90s. Federal funding began to be more flexible and available to build the capital to start those systems, not to operate them, but to start those systems. Interestingly, we had a bit of a rebirth of streetcars, and still there's many folks around the country that are having kind of starter systems. I think we've had an uneven experience so far. Some have succeeded and some not. And now, I would say we are on the cusp of, I think, one of the biggest, most major transformations, due a lot, in large part, to technology and a lot of technological innovations that we'll talk about for a lot of the evening. But I think this is probably one of the biggest shifts that we've had, that we are in the very, very beginning of. I want to make that really clear. Probably since the advent of the automobile, that what technology is going to do to change how we travel within the next 10 to 20 years is absolutely revolutionary, and we are still trying to figure out what it all means. So I don't have the answers for you, but I have lots of questions. All right, so let's talk a little bit about demand, okay? I'm sure you probably have heard a lot about this. I came into Boise this morning and saw all the cranes downtown, and you certainly have an economy that seems to be humming along. And we also know about demographic shifts. We talked a little bit about grandparents moving here, perhaps as some of the population increase following their kids and their grandchildren. But this rapid reshaping of the workforce, the millennial generation, now one of the biggest ever, is a real game changer. And the preferences of young people and millennials, while obviously always hard to kind of put people into one box and category, very, very different than their parents. Let's just look at the rates of driver's licenses, right? And I'm not saying that millennials don't drive. I am saying that they have very different preferences in terms of how they want to get around and where they want to live. And the data really does bear this out. This is the rates of licensed drivers. You can see down below there, the youngest cohort, women and men, 20 to 24, not getting licensed at nearly the rate that even just the generations just above them were. And a lot of surveys that we have done ourselves, a lot with a lot of other folks, basically looking at high quality public transportation is one of the top 3 criteria for young people to decide where to live next. They are choosing the place they want to live, and then they are often trying to find a job in that place. Just ask Denver. You may have this too. It's kind of remarkable. Same thing in DC. We're in Washington, DC. We have an influx, thousands of young people every month move to DC, no job. Look for it when they get there, stay with friends. And again, I don't want to suggest that transportation is the driver on these things, but I think it's become in the top 3 or top 5 of the reasons that certainly young people are moving places, and they have a much stronger, they may not have as much purchasing power at the moment as the previous generations, but they have a much stronger preference that drives a lot of their decisions. Let's step back a bit from millennials, and I don't want to forget other demographics, especially seniors, but in all age groups, and we are seeing this a lot in seniors, people also want to have a very different lifestyle. They want to have things that are in close proximity. They basically want walkable places, right? And that is true whether it's urban, suburban, or a small town. If you see here, the chart basically shows you this is a survey that basically shows you the current, kind of where people live existing, and the blue is sort of the preferred, right? So what people want, whether it's a small town in a rural setting or a suburban neighborhood, they want things around them. They want to be able to get places. They want to park once if they have to drive. And that's a stronger and stronger preference that we're seeing really drive a lot of consumer behavior. And then the other piece of all this that we've noticed recently, and we've done some surveys on, and I should say here too that we are part of a larger nonprofit called Smart Growth America that thinks a lot about urban and suburban revitalization, and also the economic factors that drive revitalization and redevelopment. So we surveyed a lot of companies after they have moved, and here's basically what we found. We found that companies are moving, and they are moving very intentionally to places that actually have this kind of mix of uses and this much more walkable, vibrant lifestyle. Again, whether that's downtown, a suburban setting, people don't want monoculture anymore. They want stuff around them that's exciting and vibrant, doesn't shut down at 5 p.m. And we looked at all these companies, not just in terms of those sort of qualitative attributes, but we looked at some of these, and I hope you have some of these tools at your fingertips and you've played around with them, because they're really neat. Again, the explosion of data and our ability now to be able to actually rate places right on how walkable or bikeable they are. So here's the before and after of all those companies that just moved. Walk score up from 52 to 88, transit score from 52 to 79, and the bike score from 68 to 78. So again, those companies are really looking for those more walkable places.
Before or after
Yeah. Before they moved and after they moved. So these are all the companies that relocated.
Is this like during a time period?
Yeah, I think this is the last 3 years. It was a survey of about 500 companies that moved. I can give you more information after.
Did y'all do it? Or did
Yeah, we did it. Yeah. I can definitely give you the link and the source on all this stuff. So again, in our region, we were just talking a little bit too about the difficulties, just political fracturing in our region. We have a federal district, District of Columbia. My kids are learning civics in the most unusual place to learn civics. I live 5 blocks from the U.S. Capitol, and yet we have the strangest system of government possible, and locally and regionally. So we have the federal district, we have the state of Maryland, we have the state of Virginia, right? And Maryland and Virginia are absolute competitors. They are just playing off one another all the time, going for job, going for talent, going for businesses, going for relocation. But here's the CEO of Marriott International, Arne Sorensen. And they have a campus that was built in the 1970s that is really far north in Montgomery County, maybe 20, 30 miles north of DC. And at the time, in the 1970s, it was the ideal. It was the classic corporate campus park, right? All you can see corporate campus. It was a beautiful green field. But he's thinking about something, and he's basically saying, look, he has announced that the headquarters of Marriott is going to move. And he basically says, we have to be near a transit stop. That's one of my driving concerns here, and it limits the options basically because our younger folks are more inclined to be metro accessible and more urban. And let me tell you something, they are building in the north, and probably still in the suburbs, not in the District of Columbia, but they are building the Purple Line, light rail line, just in the northern suburbs of DC in Maryland, and they're also extending the Silver Line out to the Dulles Airport in Virginia. And both of those states are now basically going for the Marriott Corporation because of what they've said. But this, again, it suggests a bigger trend to us, which I'll come back to a little bit later as well, with even a city like Indianapolis, that companies are now looking for a much more kind of vibrant and different kind of lifestyle at all kind of levels of whether it's urban, suburban, or small town. So this has all resulted in this, and I don't want to, again, I don't want to pretend that there is this, we're at 50% transit ridership in the United States. Like you all know, right? Our transit ridership for most developed countries is very low. We are very low in terms of percent transit ridership. But something is happening, which is the demand is increasing. And we are seeing some of that demand increase play out in curves like this, which is all across the US, all 50 states. Ridership that's gone up and down and fluctuated, but largely has gone up, and largely has gone up since the early 90s. And interestingly, if you see that little light blue line right at the very top there, that is the other category, okay? So there's lots of stuff in that other category, but a lot of it is what we're going to talk about tonight in terms of some of these innovations. Bus, Americans who ride transit still largely ride the bus, but rail is pretty significant in terms of both its ridership and the distance it covers. And again, this kind of light blue line up there.
James?
Yeah?
On this graph, you've gone every 10 years ending with a 2. What's happened since 2012 with these numbers?
That's a good question. I believe that they have gone up. I know that 2014 was the highest ridership on ever, or at least since World War II. It may have leveled off since the 2014. The last 4 years, it's pretty healthy. Is that what you're asking?
Well, I mean, so there is more current data than 2012.
Yeah. Okay. I think the last data is 2014 because it has to get reported up from all the transit agencies.
Okay.
We actually have a remarkable amount of, again, one of the themes that I probably won't hit hard enough tonight is just data and the availability of data. This all comes out of the NTD, the National Transit Database. And it is really an amazing resource to be able to play with. They actually have every transit agency, right, reports up to the feds and the NTD, and this is all extracted from that. So this is from the APTA, American Public Transportation Association. They do an annual fact book in 2014, I think is the most recent. It might be 15 by now. It's not too much different than what you're seeing up there. All right. So let's talk about some case studies. Again, I encourage and invite anybody to ask questions, and I'm hopeful that you will actually have some questions on this. I've divided this sort of the case studies and what's happening that I think is really interesting into two general categories that are relatively artificially separated. The first category really is a lot of these innovations in transit, and I think things that some you may be aware of, that I think are really worth looking at for a region like your own. Again, these may be a bit more built out, they may be more urban and more dense, but there's a lot of things to learn from in these places, and there's got some small places on here too. These are largely innovations in what I would call kind of late 20th century transit. These are places that are really pursuing very aggressively a build out of their system, or in the case of the last two, these are smaller, very small systems, but that have a bit of an entrepreneurial flair to them. Second category, I'll get to in a second, really involves much more the technology-driven kinds of innovations. So let's start with Denver. Ray will appreciate this. The basic story in Denver is that in the 1990s, the business community in Denver went to Silicon Valley and they wanted to recruit tech companies. And they got them to come out to Denver, and the tech companies looked around and they said, "We got a great city, it's beautiful, love the fact that you get up to the Rockies and go skiing in an hour, but if you don't solve your air quality problem and you don't get real mass transit, we're not coming." I know you may feel like you got a different story here in this region, but this is the story in Denver in the 1990s. And so this was largely led by the business community, but there were a lot of other innovations as well. I will say one of the things as a regionalist, as a regional planner, that I love about what they did in Denver, not only was the business community out front in really pushing for this really big expansion of mass transit, but they had something called the Metro Mayor's Caucus. They realized that all their local government mayors didn't get together frequently enough to begin to actually have these kinds of, honestly, arguments about if they built something like this, who was going to get their line in the stop, right? And this has actually, this continues to this day, this mayor's caucus, which they will tell you is one of the best ways that they have of actually going back and forth among all of the mayors in the region and really hammering out some really tricky, divisive, conflict-ridden, controversial kinds of things. But if they didn't have that sort of forum, they didn't feel like they actually would have gotten to where they were. So they go out in the 1990s, Silicon Valley, they say we've got to do something, they go to the ballot. In 1998, they have something called Guide the Ride. They go to the voters, and it's a sales tax increase to basically expand their light rail system. They had a couple of light rail lines that were those starter lines that I mentioned, kind of the 1990s. Federal funds build it, you've got to operate it. They went to the voters. They lost. And this is something that we see happen again and again, is going to the voters the first time on something major, you often lose. Salt Lake City had this experience, Atlanta, Georgia had this experience, but they lost pretty badly. What they did is they basically learned from those lessons. They came back again in 2004 with this thing called fast tracks. They went to the voters for a sales tax increase. They learned their lessons. I believe they listened to people, they listened to the voters that said, I'm not paying for what you brought me last time, so you need to think about it better. They were very savvy and sophisticated in the system that they went back to the drawing board on and redesigned, and they were successful. They won that vote in 2004. They had a roller coaster ride, as everybody did, through the recession of the sales tax, not the best way necessarily, not the most stable way to fund your system. But they've actually built out something that's they're building out something that's pretty remarkable from a rail and a little bit of bus rapid transit perspective. Yeah.
What was the major difference between the two?
That's an excellent question, which I should have a better answer for. But I believe basically it was in the amount they were asking for, and it was in the alignments. So they had a map that I think they scrapped early on. Probably some very similar things. They always wanted to connect to DIA. Yeah.
So from what I know, it was also the fact that the early effort had been led by the business community and not quite opposed, but not really supported by the environmental community. And in the second iteration, they worked together and found something that everybody could support.
The coalition was pretty remarkable in 2004. I do know that.
Yeah, because Coburg and Center for Livable Communities, some others came on board that hadn't been on board the first time.
Okay. Now, I don't know if you probably can't see this thing here. I'm talking about innovation, but now we're talking about big piles of money, right? So I do just want to mention this. This is the money that Denver got, especially with this what they call the Eagle P3, which was the line. Here's downtown Denver, Union Station, out to the airport. DIA just opened. I'll show you. Who's been on this line? So anybody here been on that line? What do you think?
I thought it was great.
Yeah.
Just got right off the plane right there, and then straight to the downtown, and then to the free bus.
I came out of DIA a couple of months ago, and I thought to myself, I don't know that I'm actually like English, you'll think this is a terrible thing, but I thought to myself, uh-oh, here I am, I know what's going to happen. I'm going to have to get on a shuttle bus. It's going to take me like 5 miles to like this train station, right? I'm going to have to wait. It'll be like a rental car counter experience. It's going to be awful. You walk out of DIA, you walk down into that, I think, really cool looking hotel, and you're right there. And it takes you right into downtown Union Station, and it is quick, and it is quiet. It is well designed. I tell you, we don't do this enough. I know you're not thinking about like massive heavy rail systems here, but the point is, which every tech company will tell you, is user experience, right? The user experience we give people on mass transit is not good. It's not good, traditionally. I know there's lots of folks trying the way around. All right, so just funding, I just want to point this out here. We're going to kind of come back to it. This is a loan, a federal loan called a TIFIA loan that has to get paid back. Those loans go to people with sales taxes that can pay them back, right? Really important. A lot of these places have sales tax. This is a grant, transit grant called the New Starts Grant, private equity, private activity bonds, and a lot of public-private partnerships on this line, and the local funds down here. Really important. This is basically how the big projects get built these days. And again, this is the airport line that just opened in April. Okay, Salt Lake City, very similar story. They went to their voters. They lost the first time out. They went back to the drawing board. They came back and they won. And they've won sequentially since then. And they now have, I think, again, probably one of the most robust for a city of its size is transit systems anywhere in the country. And they're doing more and more every day, and they are absolutely proud of the fact about what the businesses they're able to attract and their connection to the larger global economy because of the transportation system they're building in Salt Lake City. So let's move away from heavy rail for a second and talk a little bit more about some basic off-the-shelf technology, okay? I don't know if you all have heard about the story of a little city in Brazil called Curitiba, but back in the 1970s, Curitiba in Brazil wanted a subway system. They wanted to build subways everywhere and tunnel underground and have an awesome kind of Rio de Janeiro style subway system. They could not afford to do it. So the mayor, being pretty smart, said, all right, I'm going to make a bus work just like a subway. How are we going to do that? All right, we're going to have dedicated lanes so we're not stuck in traffic, because Brazilian traffic is a nightmare. We're going to actually have platforms where people get on board, just like a train. We're going to have people pay their fares ahead of time. We're going to have the buses trip the signals. And that has become what we now call bus rapid transit. Big innovation? I actually think it kind of is. It's kind of simple. It's politically hard to do, to take this much space and to give buses those kinds of priorities, but it is really, really important. I'll tell you, and I'll probably say this a number of times, we have a bit of an issue right now in that we're calling lots of things bus rapid transit, and I think it has a very explicit definition, much like you see here, or much like you see here domestically. We can do this in the United States. It's not impossible. This is Eugene, Oregon, dedicated right-of-way, bus rapid transit, fast buses, running, working just like trains. We can get into the kind of the details about there's pluses and minuses when you think about rail versus bus, but if you want to make buses work really effectively and efficiently, this is a great way to go. Cleveland, Ohio did something what they built the Health Line, which actually was, again, a nice kind of actually branding of their line, connecting hospitals and healthcare facilities all along in Cleveland, Ohio. It opened in 2008, replaced a pretty slow local bus service. Let's see, but here's the service zone. Okay, so it's in Pinellas County. You've got to be 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. Monday through Saturday. And you basically have to start or stop or end at a transit stop, okay? So there's a real interesting question about, like, is that where people are actually getting on the bus after they take this kind of reduced fare Uber? But that was the deal. Basically, you have choice in providers. You request a ride, whether it's Uber or it's a taxi cab company. You pay your fare and then you travel. Here's your providers. And then here are the two stops. The Transit Center was one of them, and US 19 and Walmart. And from Walmart here, which again, I think there are definitely some questions I think that remain to be answered. But people just going to Walmart with a cheap Uber ride. I don't think we're sure yet. Again, here's a little bit more of the kind of the surface zone. There's the Transit Center. There's the Walmart. Those two stops, you guys, you've got to end up or originate in those two stops. A lot of marketing on this. Did a lot of work with the media, the Tampa Bay Times. I will say this is, and we follow a lot of these kind of pilot projects. This one has some serious marketing behind it. I think they've done a really nice job with it. Obviously, they've got they got onto TV news. They really did a great job of kind of getting out in the community and letting people know. So again, just to sort of the highlights, two routes were cut. One was a fixed route, one was a community shuttle. They basically took, they knew they had to cut back funds. They took half of what they were spending on the prior service, in this case $40,000 for a 6-month pilot, and provided the low-cost Uber rides, paratransit service, dial-up service, and indeed, so far anyway, they felt it was such a success in those 2 locations, they're going to expand it to 20 more cities. Again, the idea is this is about access to the core bus network. It's not supposed to entirely replace it, although they've had this sort of interesting add-on recently, which is a late shift program for low-income workers. And in this one, again, we think about the kind of the two sort of shoulders, the 2 areas where transit is not going to be as successful, right? It's time of day and it's location. So it's either late shifts or it's lower density. And here they're basically trying a whole new program where they're going to go for free rides on Uber for low-income workers working swing shifts, late shifts, third shifts, and see how that works. Let's see if I have anything else on this. I do think these guys did a really remarkable job in a lot of their advertising. And I think what it brings up to me again, that I just want to mention, is remember the Houston model that we talked about, sort of taking from sort of hourly and 30-minute headway coverage and basically focusing on kind of trunk lines. So part of the future that I think that we are looking at here is those really, really efficient, productive corridors served by these kinds of services that can get people to those trunk lines, but provide them that premium service. Ideally, those people are so excited to ride that premium service, they're going to actually figure out how they can help us get more funds. But this is a county that, per your question earlier, we're probably not getting any local option anytime soon. But they're trying to figure out some way of being innovative to use this. Now, we talked a little about bridge and microtransit. Here's just a couple of examples of how this service works. And this, I think, is even this has now changed. What's kind of interesting about bridge, and you can tell just by it working only in DC, Boston, and Kansas City, that it's still, I think, very young and being incubated. At one point, you had to travel from this area here in downtown Washington to this area here, kind of the central business district. Again, microtransit, deviated route. We talked a little bit about how you basically tap your phone. You get on the bus, as you see here. You don't know necessarily the bus is going to be in one certain location. Sometimes you've got to walk to it. So that's a private provider. Bridge is actually not getting any public funds until this experiment came along. This is Kansas City, Missouri. This is the first microtransit experiment in the nation that involves the transit agency, involves Ford Motor Company, who is thinking more and more not exclusively just about selling cars to individual people, but about selling mobility as a service, as a utility, as it were, and bridge. So just started early this year, in early 2016. More on this now. So the maps are sort of interesting. You know, Kansas City et al. Is trying to connect a lot of the underserved areas, both from a sort of a transit perspective, also some low-income areas. So there's some hospitals, some health clinics, some universities. I understand, and again, it's supposed to run a year, so from February 16 to February 17, this is having challenges. So I don't know that I don't have all the details on exactly what's going on with this service, but I will make the following point as a former public agency person. We are not very good, I think, in the public sector about experimenting, about piloting something and admitting that it doesn't work. We feel like everything has to succeed. We sort of have it's like almost an anathema. And I think, again, in this era of this kind of transformation and disruption, we are going to have to actually understand, just like a startup does, that failing fast is okay. In fact, failing fast is fine. If we fail fast, that's a good thing, because we're going to learn from our failure, right? We're not very good at doing that. And I think whether you're an elected official, whether you're a public agency, we're going to have to get into a culture of testing, experimenting, piloting, being completely transparent with our constituents, with the general public, that we have learned things from those failures. I also think that, and this is something we're trying to do nationally, is we're going to have to learn from other communities, just like I'm showing you here. I was up talking to folks in Boston that had some really interesting ideas about ride-sharing programs that could actually transport kids around, right? So how do you tackle that problem? And they basically said to me, with the Boston regulations, there's no way we can try this, but if Nashville could try it, and we can actually learn from a pilot in Nashville, Tennessee, that is really valuable to us. So can you actually create a network where another city tries something? Good luck. And we can learn from that. But I do think that that is actually, again, really, really important as we think about different regulatory frameworks and what cities are best at.
Well, I was lucky enough to be in KC shortly after Bridge started service, so I got on the app and gave it a shot. And you know, I don't know what the experience is now. It's been a couple of months, but it was a decent experience to ride. The service was designed to replace much of their demand response service, and so that may be part of the failure if it fails. So far, it doesn't seem to have attracted many choice riders. So, but the service itself was easy to use. They give you a rally point, is what they call it, and it has to be within a 5-minute walk of wherever you are, and your drop-off point has to be within a 5-minute walk of wherever you want to go.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see sort of how, again, I think these are the, not unlike we talked about with some of those sales tax measures, sometimes those first attempts out are not going to work, right? We know this from the startup community, but we don't have that kind of ethos in some of the transportation work. So here's one that's interesting. Another first in the nation, Gainesville, Florida. Actually, a city commissioner, elected official, noticed his parents were starting to not drive, and they shouldn't be driving, and there was a senior center in Gainesville, Florida that did not attract a lot of people. So he said, we can't actually, and it was so I guess in area of the city, it was hard to serve with transit, so we said, why don't we actually pilot something where we are going to actually underwrite Uber rides so that we actually give people more access to the stuff they need and to see their family and to get out more. Yep, so here it is, Freedom in Motion from Gainesville, Florida. Interestingly, again here, and again, you all may have this experience working in the transportation sector, but we often, if you get on a bus, you get a discount if you're elderly, the disability, but not by income, right? So we actually, again, we don't really transparently give people discounts based on your ability to pay, and frankly, you know, neither do some of the private sector providers. However, partnering with this elder care nonprofit, they had a whole list of clientele and they knew their income levels. Right? So the city basically partnered with Uber and a nonprofit who actually knew all that confidential information about their ability to pay, and then has basically sort of worked a fare structure that provides you deeper discounts on Uber based on your monthly income. This apparently has been quite a success. Here's the mayor of Gainesville, Florida, cutting the ribbon for this new program, Freedom in Motion. And they, I believe, have now, they just had it, they had $15,000 to run this pilot. Again, lean startup mentality. We could learn a lot from the startup sector. $15,000. And obviously this is not going to pay for itself, but if we think about it as a sort of a, what else could we spend that money on, it may actually prove to be one of these things that in terms of connecting seniors to opportunity and getting folks to come to the senior center, may be well worth the investment. So, first of its kind in the country, $15,000. I believe they have just decided to actually expand the pilot. I'm not sure where they secured more money from, but again, another very interesting sort of approach just targeted specifically at senior citizens. All right, I know I'm talking transit, and I'm actually going to show you a picture of a bike share because we actually believe that bike shares are a form of transit. And here's the innovation of this. So you guys have bike share here. It's popping up all over the country. It's a fabulous thing. It's again one of those things. Those young workers come into different places, want to see bike share. They're all over Washington D.C. This is the innovation of bike sharing that doesn't need a dock. This has a little GPS on that big thing on the back, not that big, but over the rear wheel there. This is a startup called Sobi. And basically you check this out and you have an app and you reserve it online, but you don't have to find one of those docks to stick it into, because I can't tell you, we have a bike share right near where I live in DC. I get out there at 8 a.m. in the morning and they're either all gone, or when I get to work they're all full. So this does not require docks, so you actually lose that kind of capital expense. And so it's kind of a remarkable, actually, I think, piece of innovation. I've heard that they are now testing, believe it or not, bicycles that actually will drive themselves to you. So the other big cost of bike share is to rebalance the system. So there are apparently like driverless bicycles. I think it's somewhere in Asia, and they're actually like rebalancing themselves late at night. So there you go. The beauty of autonomous vehicles. All right, one more that I just thought was kind of cool, which is Lansing, Michigan, very small kind of community campus-based, very, very lean kind of startup to launch the bike share program here. And what I love about this, in addition to, I believe these are the ones you can leave anywhere, is that they were much lower cost, and they basically started as a partnership between a university and a startup. So I know you've got a huge startup community here in Boise, and maybe they are now thinking about a lot of these issues, but in my mind and my experience in places like Nashville, a lot of the startups that are thinking about kind of good government and a lot of this stuff, they have not really gotten yet into all the mobility services. I mean, I'm talking like lean, small, local startups. And I think some of these stuff, especially starting small, are excellent, excellent opportunities. Okay, so a few takeaways from all this. We thoroughly believe that the consumer demand for basically not being behind the wheel of your own car is just going to get bigger and bigger. And the question is really what to do about it. We can't necessarily think about it the way that we've thought about it in the past, which is highways and transit, and maybe sort of bikes over here. It's going to be a complete new ballgame in terms of how we provide mobility, just as the big car companies are actually going to realize as well. The transit's not just for big cities anymore, and innovation's happening all across the U.S. in places big and small. I will say, as much as we love all this technological sort of innovation, technology alone won't solve everything. We tend to actually not be very good at sort of matching public policy and technology to try to figure out the best solution. I'll give you a couple of examples. And we need to be clear about the best roles for each of these modes and each of these options. So I'm going to go through some things here just to round this out. Smart planning, supportive land use, public-private partnerships, especially startup partnerships, real-time data, political leadership, and local funding sources. All of these kind of elements we really think are the kind of the keys to success. So this may be a little bit hard to read, I understand, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this tomorrow morning, but there's some real basics here. Credit to Jarrett Walker out of Oregon and his consulting firm. There's some real basics about what makes transit work, right? And you may all know this from Boise, but basically, first of all, you got to have stuff on these corridors. You got to have people living near them. You got to have commercial. You got to have retail. You got to have jobs. All of those things, clustering those corridors is really key. Linearity. Are we doing the quickest line between 2 points, or are we doing one of these things where we're taking the bus and the shuttle or whatever it is, and really kind of going up and down and back and forth? There's a great little campaign right now called Straighter is Greater, and they're getting people to basically use social media to sort of provide images of the most sort of circuitous transit routes in the world. And I highly recommend just taking a look at Straighter is Greater. And then walkability is really key in terms of actually being able to access the transit stops. And then finally, continuity, making sure that there are stuff along these corridors. Again, this all completely relates back to what I was saying earlier, which is in terms of making these systems run and are really being thoughtful and strategic about transit systems, it's those high productive, high intensity corridors running much more frequently during the day. Street connectivity, sidewalks, street crossings, these are all elements that we've known about for some time. Back to the Denver DIA, getting out of the airport and going right to the train. Those things are actually very, very important when it comes to this. Now, there's a question out there, right? That's showing you all these things, and maybe you're thinking about this in your head about, won't Uber basically just replace all the need for mobility, transit and otherwise? Isn't Uber just going to kind of solve it all? And I think it's a good question to ask. It's a fine question to ask. This is a survey that was done recently of several thousand folks, and they basically and the difference here is basically they had this category of folks they called super sharers, basically people that were using car share, using Uber, using Lyft, they were using a lot of these kind of shared mobility services. I think it was 4 or more times a week, something that was much, much higher. Whether it was whether it was all of the respondents or just the people that used those shared services a lot, drove a car less to work, 30% plus, drove a car less for errands, for recreation, used public transit more, and became more physically active. So that's all sort of really interesting sort of early signs about what folks are doing and how they're using those kinds of services. Something else I always find Nate Silver stuff really interesting. We tend to also, if you ever go, look at the U.S. Census and we get journey to work data out of the U.S. Census, well, we typically ask people to kind of pick one mode of transportation, right? Did you drive? Did you carpool? Did you take transit? Did you bike? People aren't doing this anymore. People are actually using multiple modes. It depends on which day of the week and did they get a ride and a lot of young people are not also just using Uber all the time to get everywhere they need to go and to get to work. So this is just sort of an interesting little analysis by Nate Silver, who basically said, look, if you take Uber some of the time, and your ride is about $10 per ride in an Uber, and you forego the cost of actually owning a car, okay? Here's where basically here's sort of the crossing point, right? If it was $20 Uber rides, there's sort of the cost. In other words, 85% of your trips by public transit and 15% by Uber equals the cost of car ownership. You can get down below that line, then you're actually saving money. So again, and we're probably really more looking at this kind of a line, honestly, or even maybe a more gradual slope with some of the pricing now that Uber's offering and Uber Pool. So you're probably down around 50, 60% of the time. If you can actually mix transit and mix some of these shared services, just from a cost perspective, it begins to make a lot of sense.
Good question.
Yeah.
Why is it, or is it even possible, for those folks who may be positively inclined towards marketing that concept, why don't they use some of the other real cost factors, the issues, the less maintenance on infrastructure, the carbon factors, the less, that sort of thing. That would cross, those lines would cross a lot quicker.
If you actually internalized all those external costs.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are, people are, you remember I showed you the little app in Centennial, Colorado, and you had the little, at least down there, you kind of had the grams and the calories you saved by kind of being healthier. So there are these apps that are out there, these calculators, some of the environmental groups have these calculators, but, well, as well as I do, I guess, for whatever reason, those just have not caught on, I think, as much.
That's a lot of the reason why bonds don't pass and a few other things is they're not being aggressively marketed.
Right. Yeah. I think part of it is to try to figure out if we can actually capture. I mean, I'm a big believer actually in pricing in general and trying to actually internalize some of those costs to send a price signal to people, even just time of day, right? That's probably one of the biggest innovations we're going to talk about tonight. But from a lot of what this means to me is that local government is going to have many more tools in the toolbox in order to actually manage a lot of what we're going to see. And we currently just don't have those tools. And one of those tools is pricing. We have it on the parking side a little bit, but we don't have it on the congestion side. So another, you've probably seen this before. You can obviously fit all those folks onto one bus. They can all fit in their own actual vehicle. And this really goes to suggest something that is really key in all this. As a big believer in air quality and reduced emissions, everything else, but one of the biggest constraints, and different by different city, suburb, or town, one of the biggest constraints that we're going to be facing is space, right? It's space and time and basically congestion. So that is something that the rideshare, ride-hailed, ride-sourced car is actually not going to solve. We're going to be just sort of in that same problem, and we're going to have to basically figure out what is the equilibrium between this model and this model, with a lot of other services kind of in between in order to get to where we are. So we talked a lot about some of those innovations in Florida and Centennial, Colorado. Here's the old, and I think those are going to require these kind of new versions of public-private partnerships. So you guys remember all the old union stations, right? What the union stations were was basically all the private railroad providers started building their own stations. In Washington, D.C., each private train company, we had the B&O terminal down on the Washington Mall. We had the Pennsylvania Railroad, where Union Station is now. And basically what folks said is, look, for the good of the traveling public, we actually can't have you all have your own separate terminuses. We actually have to bring you all together. So you actually had a public-private partnership in the fact that we had union stations meant we brought all of those modes and all of those different forms of transportation together under one roof. And I think it's not unlike what we're talking about today, frankly, with, I think, public agencies and governmental agencies and public funding trying to figure out how can we do a little bit of what Centennial, Colorado is doing, right? How can we actually get the Ubers and the Lyfts and the Bridges of the world to actually integrate with some of these other services for the greater public good? And how can we begin to understand, not that there's a bright line and a wall between the private side and the public side, but that we need to begin thinking about the cost differential of, should I really run a bus at midnight and pick up 3 people, or should I actually use those funds to figure out if I can subsidize some of these private ride-sharing companies? And here's my big plea here now. So hear me out on local option, because I think you can get it. They are incredibly popular at the polls. 7% approval rate for transportation measures, twice the approval rate of all ballot measures, and successes across all geography, party, population. Local option taxes are the way that many places, not all, but many places, are going about some of this, and they're some of the most flexible funding that you can use. And I say that from personal experience working in California. They're not all sales tax. A lot of them are property tax, but many are sales tax. And of course, there's bonds and vehicle fees. So these ballot measures are increasingly being used all across the country. They're becoming, again, in some ways more successful as you go through the years. And I would just say as well, looking at this chart on state spending on transit, I know that here in Idaho, a lot like other states, but no state funding in either investment in transit, and I wonder, is that something that could change, whether that's actually state funding or local option funding. So I want to wrap up with, finally, with one last city that I haven't talked about yet, but I think kind of embodies a lot of the spirit of sort of the innovation and forward thinking, and that's Indianapolis, Indiana. So very similar to a lot of our other kind of mid-sized cities we've talked about, whether it's Nashville, Tennessee, Raleigh, North Carolina. Indianapolis has a pretty struggling bus service network with some very productive routes and some very unproductive routes down here. And they've been trying for a long time to figure out how they can basically have a better public transportation system in Indianapolis. This is a little hard to see, but we talked a little bit about those kind of the idea of those kind of high network, high frequency corridors, okay? So this on the right, this is Indianapolis, this is Marion County, it's a unigov in Indianapolis, so they merged back in the 60s. And this is our existing service. So red is the most frequent service. Blue is the next level down, okay? So this is the airport down here. This is the 8 line. So you can kind of see, and the green is about 45-minute, 60-minute headways, okay? So basically we've got green spread all over, and we've got a couple of productive reds. This is the system that they want, okay? So they're going to fewer, more high productive transit corridors, right? And that's the proposal that they want to actually get to. And they believe that using a lot of the elements we talked about tonight, they can actually make a whole, complete kind of transportation network on that proposal. This is a little bit of the sort of just the schematics of their downtown. Not unlike here, they've actually just opened a multimodal transit center earlier this year in Indianapolis. It's going to be kind of the heart and the hub. Again, this is the existing network. I think this is the network that they want to get eventually. Something else that Indianapolis has done, and this is all led by the former mayor, I'm going to talk about in a second, is they have really taken car sharing to heart. And even though you can get Uber, you can get Lyft, you can get a number of providers in Indianapolis, Indianapolis signed a deal with a French company to basically do an all-electric car sharing fleet all over the city of Indianapolis. So the mayor, Greg Ballard, was a Marine. He fought in the First Persian Gulf War, and he felt very, very strongly that energy security was the thing that motivated him for public office. And he wanted to have a model of basically a low energy efficient city. So he's put a solar grid out of the airport. He's putting photovoltaics on all the government buildings. And he wants basically to figure out how he can get the folks of Indianapolis to see and touch and feel electric vehicles so that people will begin to actually start using them. So, signed a deal with a company and launched a service earlier this year called Blue Indy. So, 200 locations all over Indianapolis. It works a lot like a kind of traditional kind of bike share system. There are pods, because you think about electric cars, one of the constraints is you got to plug them in. So they basically have pods all over Indianapolis. You can become a member. You can check it out. You can go to your phone. You can rent one of these all-electric car-sharing vehicles all over Indianapolis. But not only that, he said, you know, the other thing we got to do is we got to think about those kind of like really basic modes, like getting on your feet and riding a bicycle. And so they built something called a cultural trail. When I heard about the cultural trail, I thought, well, that's nice. You know, it's going to be a little like just a little signpost between a couple museums. That's what a cultural trail will be. But they have made this, honestly, like the interstate highway of trails. This thing extends all through Indianapolis neighborhoods. You can get everywhere on this thing. And it is just a remarkable piece of very basic, simple, elegant infrastructure. When you come to an intersection, this is a cultural trail at an intersection. It is highly visible. It is safe because it has bulb outs. It is highly marked in terms of this is one of the northeastern cities that that we work with and are aware of that I think has done some really good stuff around the health line. There was lots of questions and still lots of questions about, as we'll talk about in a sec, can this kind of mass transit actually begin to affect not just people's travel behavior, but affect development patterns, i.e., can this kind of like frequent transit actually attract development along a corridor so that actually more people can live and work along that corridor? A big debate that has gone on and on. There's general acceptance that really good frequent rail, heavy rail, light rail, streetcar will attract the kind of development. There's a lot of questions about, does a bus give the same sense of permanency, right, that an actual kind of fixed guideway, fixed rail, streetcar gives? So here's the corridor. This is Euclid Avenue in Cleveland, where the health line is before it was built, and here is Euclid Avenue after it's getting built. So that's one maybe not scientific, but it does seem like there was things happening around. And this, again, Cleveland will tell you, we are seeing projects pop up along this corridor. I think part of it not only is the frequency, frankly, but is the branding too, right? So I know you've heard from SIR and some folks here that have been to the speaker series, how we brand and sell these kinds of services, market them as premium services, give them that feel, again, that user experience. This is different. I'm going to get taken somewhere really quickly. It's going to be hassle-free. I want to live on that corridor. I want to work on that corridor. It gives developers a sense of certainty, which is another big, really interesting sort of quandary, is, are we giving the development community enough certainty? It seems to have done that in Cleveland. Yeah.
How did that impact the rail system, though, in Cleveland? I mean, for a long time, early on, Cleveland had a decent rail system for a city like it.
Yeah.
And actually, there was a lot of usage of it, and the metro downtown station was very busy. So did the bus service impact the usership of the rail?
I don't know enough about this corridor and where it runs. I believe that this basically parallels an older route that was another bus route, so it was a much slower bus route, and they sort of sped it up. Cleveland itself, I will tell you, just has as many aging transit systems do. They have a lot of capital issues on their system. So in many ways, doing this actually is not bad, because you're kind of trying to save at least some of your capital dollars to then go in and kind of maintain and rehabilitate your rail network, because you're right, they do, for a city that size, have a pretty remarkable rail system. But it is struggling. It's struggling for want of, I think, a dedicated funding source.
Well, it's the maintenance and aging of the equipment that has to be replaced, because it's been in process for decades,
Of the rail system.
Rail system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All the examples you've used so far that I'm familiar with are all predicated on there being a mechanism for local option taxing authority that allows an entity to go to the voters and get this money.
Yep.
Idaho doesn't have that.
Yep.
So all of these examples are, oh great, you just have to go to the voters. Well, we can't, so what do we do?
Right. I'll give you the part two of the case studies that you don't have to have it as much, but I'm going to end on, I'll steal my ending, which is, you really actually kind of have to have it. There's things you can do with other sources of money that are going to be much cheaper and in many ways more nimble. But the longer you don't have that option, that local option, the harder it's going to be. Anyway, we'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, we helped release a report earlier this year on bus rapid transit, looking at, I'll give you some highlights in a second, but it is pretty remarkable, even though we don't have a lot of systems that are really kind of in the ground yet, and we have a lot of systems that are calling themselves bus rapid transit. Nevertheless, we are looking at a lot of interest in either partial or full kind of dedicated bus rapid transit service all over the U.S. So we're hoping that a lot of this service will begin to come online. We invested in a study. Yeah, go ahead.
So are these cities that have expressed interest in going after funding for bus rapid transit?
The planned cities have. The red is under construction, and the blue is partially funded and has a little bit more.
Okay, because for instance, we have a plan here to do a bus rapid transit
Yeah.
corridor, but we're not at a point where we can go after funding.
Yeah.
So the map may be actually more robust than what you're showing.
Yeah, and I think even just the last couple of years, I think there have been a lot more cities that have actually had sort of plans on the drawing board. Again, though, I'll tell you, let's see if it's not actually up there. So that's Fresno, California, and we see this happening a lot. They had a bus rapid transit system on the books. It was actually funded, and then basically the city council went back and started taking out the dedicated lanes. They got a lot of pushback. Nashville, Tennessee is actually not up here. Nashville, right there in Tennessee. Nashville had a federally funded project called the AMP that basically kind of blew up. And we can talk a lot about why that happened, but basically there was not enough community neighborhood support. We had a couple of property owners, commercial property owners that were going to have left turns restricted, and they got bent out of shape, and there honestly just was not enough neighborhood community grassroots support. And so this is not easy. even doing something as relatively speaking as cheap as a bus is not that easy. It definitely takes a lot of community support. Okay, so I just wanted to come back a little bit to this, and I'm going to get a little bit more to the technological kind of innovations in a sec, but there really is this question out there about whether bus rapid transit, making a bus work really quickly, can actually begin to change the psychology, honestly, of the development community to actually attract more development. And I do think that's part of what it is. So, first study that actually has found a positive correlation, released earlier this year, Chris Nelson at the University of Utah, now down in Arizona, did actually find a positive correlation with office share in bus rapid transit. First study in the U.S., not enough as many as we would like, but actually looking at real case studies on the ground before and afters. And again, overall aggregation, job change positive from before the recession to after the recession. So we're seeing we're definitely seeing something happen like you could see in Cleveland there, happening along these bus rapid transit corridors. Okay. Perhaps now to get a little bit more to like what you do if you don't necessarily have a massive local option tax. So this is Houston. Houston went through a really interesting complete rethink of its entire bus network. And what they did is, I should actually show you this map first. Basically, it's hard to see these kind of gray areas, but the first, this right here, this frequent network, not that one, this frequent network is basically what exists right now, okay? You can't really see, but there's a lot of very infrequent service that Houston had that was part of their larger network. Their board of directors, transit agency board of directors, was led through a whole strategic planning process where they basically come through the other side and they said, all right, we can't provide lousy service to 80% of the population. It's not working. We have to provide really good premium service to fewer people, and we're going to risk our political lives on this. So they redid it, they redesigned it. It was very little increase in cost, but their whole point was we've got to basically provide people that premium 10-minute service so they begin to actually really feel and taste what a real transit system that provides premium service would look like. It, I think, has had some bumps, to be honest, but in the first half of the year, because they only just kind of reopened it, you at least see the comparison there in the blue from prior to orange in 2016. So you are seeing an increase in ridership. I don't have the entire Houston story, but I know it's been a really big deal, and it's been tough for them to implement. But again, we're going to see this as a theme in some other cities as well that have undertaken these things. And that network that they want to have is, I think, still not. It is not entirely out there, but they're trying to figure out how they can do that. Basically, looking at cutting some of the less productive service, and that's one that the community gets obviously very upset about. So you've got to really think about how you do that thoughtfully. I want to end on sort of this section of case studies with a couple of examples that I got to know the last 7 years that I think are pretty remarkable. The first one is North Central Montana Transit. This is up in Havre, Montana, up on the High Line, Route 2 near the Canadian border. This, I think, is so fascinating because they had a transit system that basically went under. And they said, all right, we still have all these needs in our community to connect people to healthcare and downtown and shopping and friends. So what are we going to do? And this was actually born out of the healthcare side of the community service healthcare side. So those folks basically got together and said, all right, well, we actually understand our customers and our clients where they have to go. So we're going to design and develop a new system. We're going to get volunteer drivers because we can't pay drivers. So they actually got these guys who basically are railroad retirees to be volunteer drivers because Havre is a big railroad town. And they partnered with the University of Montana up there actually to run, not only to design the buses and have this kind of depot and garage as part of some training, but also to actually develop a biofuel that is actually sort of locally sourced and locally grown. So this is like the homegrown North Central Montana transit system. It is small, it's run by a nonprofit, but it is very effective. It actually, it is fixed route. It gets people where they want to go, and it's a pretty remarkable story, again, sort of that grew out of the bankruptcy of the former system. Another very small town that is a little bit different but similar in some ways is River Cities up in South Dakota, New Pierre, South Dakota. Interesting here that it really is, this is a very much rather than fixed route demand response. Again, started relatively recently and grew out of a lot of hospitals and human service agencies. So they have, if you notice the growth in these numbers here, from 12,000 to 300,000 rides in 2011. They have 24-hour service, not on all their routes, but they do actually have some 24-hour service. If you want to know more about this, we have a couple of case studies we've written up about them. Sometimes in the smallest communities, we find the biggest sort of ideas and innovations, and these guys are a good example. All right, I want to talk now about a few things that I think maybe are a little bit more, maybe less of the traditional innovation and more of the 21st century technological innovation. Four case studies. The first two in particular, I'm going to go into detail on: Centennial, Colorado, and Pinellas County, Florida. So here's where this stuff is changing so quickly, and the definitions I'm going to give you right now people either they may change in a year. But I do want to get a little bit of, and please again ask questions if you have them, because none of this is set in stone, but it's kind of important to understand what these different kinds of family of services are all about. So car sharing, right? Car sharing is this is sort of, it's been around for a long time, but it's only been recently, again, with the advent of technology, that people have been able to start car sharing. You could think of this as a rental car, is actually a car share, right? It is actually owned as a fleet by a company. But now you have companies like Car2Go that allow people basically to sort of become members, to book online, and to basically take out a neighborhood kind of car whenever they want, go whenever they want. There's usually boundaries that are drawn around it. Something very interesting that's also happening right now is that it's not just a fleet model like Car2Go, but there actually is now peer-to-peer car sharing. So there are companies and startups that are actually taking, basically it's kind of like, think of it as Airbnb for your car. So you can take your car with their insurance and you can basically rent your car out when it is not being used. And again, if you think about that kind of innovation from an efficiency perspective, you think about those young people that are moving places that don't actually want to own a car. Hey, peer-to-peer car sharing, that sounds pretty good. All right, the next two are really important because they get confused all the time. Ride sharing and ride hailing, right? You know the difference between these two? Wants to explain it for us. So this is generally all lumped together as ride sharing. Ride sharing is something that's very specific, which is I am already planning to take a trip and I'm going to give you a ride,
It's
right?
like the people on the Bay Bridge.
Right. I'm already going, and you're jumping in. And in fact, I want to get some pictures of the slugs, the commuters in the Bay Area and DC.
And the people who took the bridge, they got the advantage because if they picked up a couple of people, then they could go in the high occupancy.
That's right. They go in the HOV lane. And that's a great example of basically a public policy that spurs basically kind of consumer action, and a really positive one. So before we had any apps or anything, I moved to the Bay Area in 1998 and did exactly that. I jumped on in Oakland, I got in a car with people I didn't know, and we zoomed across the Bay Bridge and we beat everybody over there. It was fabulous, for free, right? Didn't even ask me for gas money. So that's ride sharing. Ride sharing is somebody's already going there and I'm getting a ride with them. Ride hailing is taxis. Ride hailing is Uber, ride hailing is Lyft. That is, somebody's not already going there, they're coming to pick you up and give you a ride, right? Again, one of the oldest services that's around. The innovation of Uber and Lyft obviously is multiple, but is largely that is all app-based. That I can do it with the ease of the touch of my phone. That is ride hailing. Why is that different, and why is it important that those are two differences? Because as we'll talk about in a second, the proliferation of ride hailing is not a bad thing. It provides people more mobility and more options. But there is a future in which ride hailing actually puts more vehicles on the road, puts more vehicle miles traveled on the road, puts more congestion onto streets if we're not careful. And so we want to encourage ride sharing, we want to encourage ride hailing, but we want to be thoughtful about how we do it and where we do it. Believe it or not, I know you've heard a lot about Uber, believe it or not, there is now Uber congestion in downtown Seattle with the young Amazon.com workers getting out of their Ubers, all the same. It's like a school drop-off, right? The curbside drop-off. People are fighting for curb space, and people are dropping them off in the middle of the street. And Uber has actually, again, I think, innovated in a very interesting way, right? Which is a surge charge, right? So Uber itself is putting a surge charge on. People don't like the surge charge. I don't like the surge charge. But the surge charge is actually very smart. And again, I think it suggests something about the future in which a lot of these vehicles will be running around, and a future in which, we'll talk about in a second, I'm not going to go into detail on, there is no driver behind the wheel, and that Uber is autonomous, right? Because that is the long-term play. And that's a very different prospect. Okay, van pools, you've got van pools here, right? It's basically an existing trip. It's usually a volunteer driver. It can be a contracted driver. It's basically ride sharing. It typically is employer worksite related. Again, from van pools we go to microtransit. Microtransit, I wish we had better terms. Communications people, help us on all the terms here, right? Microtransit is really tiny buses that you can't get in. One vehicle, demand driven. It can be fixed, but it's usually largely a deviated route. So microtransit is basically a whole new, again, set of services that are largely private. Bridge, we're going to talk about in a second, is a startup operating in Boston, DC, and Kansas City. Again, all driven by your phone. So I go on my phone when I'm in one of those three cities. I sign up for Bridge. I say I'm here and I want to go there, and it basically figures out through its algorithms a bus that comes to pick me up. I pay about $4 or $5. I get on that bus. It's maybe 8 passengers, and with a couple of other stops. It may not actually come to me. I may actually have to walk to a stop. It's not a stop. It's just where it's telling me to go, the most efficient meeting of the bus and me, right? So it's not a set schedule, it's not a set route, but I am doing it all through my phone. Obviously transit, we know what it is, we've talked about it, it's the thing we've had, and then finally bus rapid transit, as I've mentioned already. A true innovation that needs a lot more help. So this is by no means the actual exhaustive list here, but there are these innovations that have happened over time in a relatively short amount of time, in the last 8 years, right, that are really now allowing us to do all of these things and to allow all these new services to proliferate. And the biggest one is geolocation, right? So that really changed everything. As soon as somebody could tell where I am, everything changed in terms of transportation and mobility. This is what allows Uber to work. It's what allows Bridge to work. It's what allows Waze to work if you use the traffic app. And from that, you obviously have all the sophisticated software that runs ride matching, dynamic routing and scheduling. We just talked about Bridge. The latest innovation, by the way, which I think is incredibly a game changer, is in-app fare payment, right? So how many times have you gone to somewhere and you're looking for change? Or I go to these cities all the time. I can never figure out how much the bus costs. It's really, really hard. And then I'm struggling for my change, and I'm wishing I had just something I could swipe. Well, Go Denver and Go LA, two apps that are piloted through Xerox, partnership with Xerox, and it is in-app fare payment. So by that I mean not just do you pay for your bus, but you can actually get Lyft, you can get Uber, I can get a bike share, I can get it all in one.
You pay for parking on it?
I don't know if you can pay for parking yet.
That one here.
I don't know if it's actually in the app yet. And I will tell you, to be honest, Uber has pulled out already of the Denver app. So we're still in the Wild West of all of this stuff. It is still being negotiated. And then finally, there's the ones I'm missing up here, but driverless vehicles being one of the biggest and a huge game changer that is coming very quickly. All right, so let's talk a little bit about a couple of these examples. There's Denver. Again, back to Denver, you see DIA up in the top right-hand corner. There's a town recently incorporated called Centennial, Colorado, just south of downtown, in Littleton, Englewood, and Aurora. You can see it there just kind of outlined in red. One of the great things about Centennial is it's on the light rail system that we just talked about in Denver, called the Dry Creek Light Rail Station right here. Okay, so you can get up to downtown Denver really easily because this is now a great transit system that works. The problem is getting over to the Dry Creek Light Rail Station from any of these neighborhoods here. Right? So, again, gray is the city of Centennial, and then this is what we're going to talk a little bit about in terms of this service area right now. All right, so the problem was they couldn't really run very efficient bus service to get to the light rail. And because people couldn't really get to the light rail, it was a little too far away, they got in their car and they drove all the way to downtown Denver, added to the traffic congestion, added the parking problem, etc. So they decided, all right, we've got to come up with a better solution to this. So they partnered with Lyft, and they basically said, all right, we're going to subsidize your ride on Lyft to the light rail station if you take the light rail and go from there. And they believed, and I think this is still an experiment in the middle. These are all experiments in the middle of happening. I don't have a lot to report to you yet, but I am saying these are really fascinating cutting-edge experiments. They believe that basically subsidizing free Lyft rides will be cheaper than the poor-performing route that they ran previously to get to the station. It'll get more people to the station. Is that actually true? We're going to find out. Here's one of the many. The many little great kind of web pages and interfaces trying to convince people about kind of why they should do this. Here's the coolest thing. Okay, this is I love this. This is just awesome. This is the app basically that is all about this program. And what I love about this is the sooner, cheaper, greener. Okay, so I'm a bit more of a cheapskate than I am in a hurry, so I'm going to go cheaper. Or I'm a tree hugger and I want to save emissions, so I'm going to go greener. And it will change how it basically, again, this is the in-app, this is the beauty of all the in-app stuff. It actually looks at multiple modes. And here's the pilot, right? So if you want to take the Lyft, you can take the Lyft for free. It reminds you, yep, it actually is free. You get on the light rail, you get there, and then you get a 3-minute Lyft right on the other end. So, and here's some of the stuff that you can also, it shows you, I think this is about if you're biking, this much, or you spend this much. Anyway, this is the in-app beauty of actually now combining these modes in the app. It's pretty remarkable. It's simple, and that's why it's remarkable. Here, by the way, the partners that are involved in this. This is obviously taking both public and private funds, right? So, but I point this out because I think this is again kind of part of the future. So. We have what's called a Transportation Management Association, Denver South, TMA. Obviously, Lyft is the provider. Xerox, I told you, is the company that's building the apps both for Denver and for Los Angeles, and looking to do many more. They do a lot of the parking. I don't know if they do your parking here. CH2M Hill as a consultant, VIA as another transportation provider. And then with all of these folks down here in partnership with Transit Agency, the Transilite Advocacy Group here in Denver, advocating for mass transit. Barrett Pierce Consulting Firm. This is a brand new Denver, fascinating mobility choice blueprint initiative that's actually started kind of by the former Colorado DOT director in the Denver Chamber, the Metro Chamber. It's all about basically trying to bring the next generation of transportation to the Denver Metro. Rocky Mountain Institute, a think tank on energy issues, and the Metro Chamber. These are the kinds of partnerships that these innovations in transportation, I think, are going to require. Very much more sophisticated than, and probably more diverse and bigger tent than we've seen before. Going to move on to Pinellas County. Any questions on Centennial? Yeah.
Tell me if this is an appropriate time to ask. It just has to do with, for instance, I'm pretty familiar with the Salt Lake system in Dallas. Mm-hmm. And is there what's the correlation between the success of these particular systems and the fairly severe deterioration of their roads?
When you say deterioration, you're talking the actual sort of the pavement and
the pavement condition.
I've never actually seen any. I mean, everybody hates that stuff, right? Your front end's out of alignment and the potholes. I've never seen anything that links deterioration of roads. I do think where there's a link is congestion.
Well, I know that in Utah they're no longer funding their roads anywhere near like they used to, and they've got in Salt Lake, and they've got more roads. And
okay.
As a result, it's some of the worst roads in the country.
Huh. I haven't heard that. I know the state legislature just provided the Utah DOT a whole bunch of general fund money for roads, but maybe that doesn't go all the way down to maybe you're talking about the local streets rather than the state highways.
Yes.
So I've never seen any studies that link deterioration of roads to transit ridership, but I do think there is an absolute correlation between congestion and transit ridership, right? Okay. That is really clear. Okay, Pinellas County, Florida. So if you can imagine the geography here, this is the Tampa Bay. This is downtown Tampa right here, right? This is the Gulf of Mexico. This is St. Petersburg, Clearwater, one of the most urban counties in Florida. Speaking of local option, all right? Here's a county that may never get local option. They have tried several times. And the most recent attempt was this chart, this map, this graphic that was supposed to get people very excited about all the different services that they were going to get. They could vote for the sales tax, called Green Light Pinellas back in 2014. They're going to have a rail across the bridge. They're going to have bus rapid transit, a streetcar up and down Pinellas County between Clearwater and St. Pete. But the opposition was fierce. The opposition in a lot of Florida counties is absolutely fierce. They led a very sophisticated and very successful campaign, no tax or tracts, which ended up in a defeat of about 62% against in the ballot measure. And this was the second or third time Pinellas County had been out for a vote. So they basically said, all right, we're going to have to go not just back to the drawing board, because we're not going to go for sales tax again anytime soon, to try something completely different. And they knew they were going to have to cut service. I mean, this was not just about expanding and building rail. This was about actually just running and maintaining the bus system. So PSTA, Pinellas Suncoast Transportation Authority, basically launched a partnership with Uber and a taxi cab company. Interesting. So they actually did it with a couple of different providers. And they basically said, unlike Centennial that said we'll pay Lyft, we'll pay your Lyft fare entirely. Here, PSTA said, whoops, sorry. They said we'll pay half the fare, up to $3 a ride, from the designated stops within the zone. Also, as all you transit folks know, you absolutely have to provide accessible transportation, ADA, wheelchair compliant. So not only the taxi cabs, they had accessible vans. And really interesting, simple. They provided a phone number. So they basically said, we're not going to rely on you just to have a smartphone. We're actually going to, this is an experiment pilot. We're going to see actually how many people call up and use the phone service, and we'll basically enter it into the Uber app ourselves. Again, we don't have, well, we have some initial results on this, not everything. So the idea was, and the mayor said, all right, I'm thinking this thing is actually having an impact. So they launched a study, they looked at property values within one block, and they increased 148% around the cultural trail just within a couple of years. And the other kind of amazing thing, speaking of companies and corporations, the Cummins Engine Corporation in Indiana, based in Columbus, Indiana, relocated to Indianapolis. When they relocated their headquarters, they had one basic kind of space demand, and that was to open their doors onto the cultural trail in downtown Indianapolis, because that's what all their young workers wanted, and the folks they were trying to hire was to open on this thing. So I know some of you may think of, oh, this looks like a bike path, or just anything typical. Please, if you're anywhere in Indianapolis, you have to check this out. This is what the interstate highway is to the local street. It is beautiful. It is signed. It sort of speaks for itself and sells itself, and it is just a truly remarkable advent. Yeah.
So you said the former mayor, what cost him his job?
He actually wanted to get out of office. He had 2 terms. He didn't want to run again. This is him. This is yeah. He actually had enough in taking a break. I don't think he's going to take a break for long. But I really want to end on him. So Greg Ballard, I mentioned him. He was the reason for this map in the back are the bus rapid transit lines. So mayor of Indianapolis, not a politician. He gets into office the first time ever, runs for mayor in 2008. He beats a Democrat in a Democratic city. Everybody gets surprised. And then he goes and he sort of looks around and analyzes things for a couple of months, and he says, all right, so Indiana, 99 counties, and a majority of them have lost population, but the ones around Indianapolis have not lost population, and I think this is going to be the future of a strong state is going to be a really strong kind of greater Indianapolis metropolitan region. The other thing he said, and this was, he was honing these arguments as he went to the state legislature, and he said, all right, I think in Indiana we have a trade deficit that needs to be fixed, but here's our trade deficit. We produce the most number of graduate degrees of any state in the country. We have the least number of residents with graduate degrees. So there's our trade gap. Now, how do we reverse that trade gap? Is we make places like Indianapolis, places like South Bend, places like Columbus and Bloomington, some of the best, either big cities or small towns. People don't want to leave. They want to stay here. So I need to do a couple of things with that. I need to completely reform the education system. I need great schools so I can attract families back to live in Indianapolis. And I need a great transportation system. So I'm going to have a local option tax. Right? This is Indiana, a state that doesn't grant any kind of authority to local jurisdictions whatsoever. He spent 3 years going to his legislature to go get that local option tax, 3 years. And each year he got a little bit further. Now, he had an army behind him, to be very clear. The Indianapolis Chamber was one of the big proponents of this effort. And finally, the 3rd year, the legislature said, all right, we'll grant you your local option tax, but with a whole list of conditions, all right? You're not building any trains with it. It has to be an income tax on a sales tax. It has to go here, here, and here. They put all kinds of strings. But after successfully getting that local option tax, they are going to the ballot November the 8th in Marion County, Indianapolis. And they are going to basically build what you see behind you in that map, which is 4 bus rapid transit corridors that I think are game changers. And those buses are going to be all electric, actually in road charging, really kind of an interesting, kind of neat little innovation. And after 8 years, I believe he succeeded. And now it is going to be up to the voters in Indianapolis and Marion County in November to see what they think.
Another question.
Yeah.
You showed the trail that was created throughout the area. What part of his budget suffered, or where did they get the money to?
They actually built that trail entirely with private funding.
No kidding.
And they built it, they've got a pretty big philanthropic community there, and the Eli Lilly.
So they bought the right of way and everything with private money?
I believe they did. It was 1 lane. Basically, they took a parking lane. It took a parking lane, and it is now maintained privately through a nonprofit. Yeah, it was done, I believe, raising money, and again, he spearheaded a lot of this, but they had a lot of people from sort of the civic and philanthropic sectors. They have a bike share system there. If you go to Indianapolis, ride that trail, it connects out to trails beyond, and they are now seeing actual just economic and land use changes all along that corridor. And what you're seeing, I think, in Indianapolis is that kind of picture and vision of that kind of complete, nascent, very early on, but I think a really fascinating approach to a very complete, holistic approach to a transportation system. So Mayor Ballard is certainly my inspiration. I would be absolutely delighted to take questions if people have. Yeah.
People, I mean, you talked a lot about, you know, these fleets of Ubers that are just going to happen, but I'm kind of wondering about the sustainability of the, I mean, obviously once we have autonomous vehicles and they can drive around without any people in them, then it's not going to be a problem. But in the meantime, I'm just wondering how sustainable it is to expect people to drive their own vehicles at rates that are going further and further down, and, you know, with all of the potential danger there is to both the drivers and the riders. It just seems to depend on an underclass of people, you know, a whole fleet of driving Miss Daisies, and I'm not sure how we can actually count on that necessarily happening in every city.
Yeah, this is like a whole. So it's an excellent question in terms of the sustainability of this. I will say, I think, of the many critiques that have been sort of lobbed at Uber, I think one that really sticks in my mind is the problem that I think all of us actually have, all of us as consumers who own vehicles, which is we completely underestimate the cost of owning a vehicle. And we aren't very good at kind of depreciating that as an asset. And the problem with a lot of the Uber folks is, and I think they've gotten better about this, but for instance, they were going to launch Uber Black in Boston, right, which is the big town car, right? And you know that, like, as a driver, you're a contractor, so all these folks went out and bought these massive Uber town cars, right, at like 50 grand a pop. Well, guess what? Uber decided not to launch its Black car in Boston, right? So these are, you know, those aren't very sustainable business practices. And I do think that and I haven't seen all the numbers on this, but people are basically not really properly accounting for the depreciation of their vehicle. Having said that, I do think that we're heading towards autonomous. We didn't really get into that this evening, but I think you're going to see more and more of these services. I mean, the most sustainable thing is ride sharing, right? The true ride sharing where you're going somewhere anyway. But I think you're going to see ride hailing actually only increase. And I think and as you say, that autonomous, those fleets of autonomous that will be here sooner than the whole fleet turns over, that's going to be between 7 and 10 years, maybe sooner. Other questions?
So a lot of these examples, this is a good one with that you've used, really are built on, there's a sort of a high demand, high capacity spine, or a couple of spine spokes that are essential for all the other pieces to work, all the other flexible pieces, innovations to work. Have you seen an example where it hasn't, other than maybe some of those little towns you did where they're addressing senior needs? Is that you need the spine of transit,
or an example where it's worked without the spine.
Where it's worked without. How can you?
I mean, so much of it is geography, right? What you're constrained by. So I think a lot of it is really, probably best done through algorithms and computers and not humans drawing the lines of the map. I think so I'm sure it probably works, maybe in older cities like in Europe, they probably have much different architecture of their transit networks. So when you think about, the way that we built our cities in the United States, really, off the East Coast, but the rest of the country, right? We're in grids, and we are in grids. And we firmly believe that if we can maximize those grids and provide high capacity, any kind of service, right? Whether it's buses, whether it's shuttles, whether it's HOVs, I mean, using those grids and then feeding into those grids, I think makes the most sense And where you're not doing that, then you're doing deviated route. Then you're doing the bridge and the shuttle and the Uber, where you're kind of going point to point. But I think the big finding here, and I really firmly believe it's true, is the quickest, the quickest line, between the 2 points, providing that premium service, providing it frequently, so that people can depend on it. That's sort of the gold.
Yeah, we've got a couple of very, very, like the State Street line and the Fairview line, where there's bus lines that are heavily used.
Mm-hmm.
But people will make a decision. It's very much like that Centennial example you gave, for an entire trip based on how convenient that last mile or that last half mile or that last 2 miles is. If they can't get to that really quickly, there's not a really easy way. They just hop in their car and do the entire trip with their car, pay for the parking, and drive off.
Actually, there's a really interesting, and if you think about this, think about whether you would feel this way too, right? There's a piece of psychology that I've seen written up, which is people are much more willing to take a ride or a shuttle or a walk or a bike ride on the front end of a transit trip. You get on a bus or a train and you get off, you better want to get off right where you're going, right? It is, I mean, you can link those trips, but there's something about actually then getting off and having to walk another mile, right, that makes it feel like that's just not, I'm just going to go point to point, I'm going to go straight there. Which then suggests, again, this is not static, right? You are a growing region, that you want to make sure that you are putting whatever you decide those kind of corridors are, those kinds of spines, that network, that you are attracting that kind of development and the high intensity stuff that people want to get to that's right there. That's why that end use destination is so important, whether it's jobs, whether it's retail, ideally the mix of all of the above. Yeah.
Yeah, your example in Houston, where they consolidated some of those lower frequency routes into those high frequency spines. Have you seen any examples or studies? And I know it's pretty evident that those types of services will attract new jobs and housing, but have you seen any studies that illustrate the overall growth impact, if it has anything to do with sprawl mitigation, or particularly in places where there's limited land use controls, if that type of concentrated investment can attract more growth in a particular area and then affect other areas?
Specifically on bus? Bus borders?
Really anything. I mean, I would think BRT or light rail as well.
I think I would think that if anybody's done it in Salt Lake City and sort of envision Utah and the work that they've done within the Wasatch area, our experience in California when I worked on this very intensely there was you really had to kind of have a sort of a green belt. You had to have sort of a boundary. It could be movable. The local governments could decide, well, we're going to move it out this year because we've got that much. And the problem, of course, with that was that they never built enough and developed enough inside the growth boundaries, so you then had prices rise. Right? It became unaffordable. So if you kind of draw that boundary, then you've got to get in. I haven't seen any studies, though, that basically say, absent those kinds of tools, that the transit system itself was actually successful in pulling people in. You got to remember, too, that sometimes transit can actually induce longer trips. Like there is a phenomenon where if you make something really easy, an hour-long high-speed rail commute can actually induce people to live further out. This is what happened in the Central Valley in California. People would, we had this thing called the ACE train. There'd be a 2-hour service from Stockton, California to San Jose, and we saw it as a transportation success and a land use failure. But I have not seen that kind of evidence. I think there are other factors at play, largely in terms of transportation. And then again, the other thing I think is price. And if you think about this as the other challenge we're going to have is if we talked about autonomous vehicles basically driving down the cost of travel, which is a good thing, it will then actually flood the network and flood the system. And so we're going to have to figure out a way to dynamically price, which is not a bad thing, which is what we do in the movie theaters and airline tickets and everything else. But we're going to figure out a way to dynamically price travel and use some of those revenues ideally to fund the transportation system.
I would comment on that, that owning a car, you've got a high fixed cost, and a fairly flat variable cost. Uber makes all that cost variable, and so it doesn't have the effect of pulling in more, because every ride has to be worth doing now. People are more likely to consolidate errands and things like that because their variable cost has gone up.
That's true. I guess what I was saying that once we get to, if you imagine sort of the fleets of autonomous and electric, so the price differential, that is going to be such a lower price, right? That in that future, in that scenario, that people will actually consume a lot of that, even at a variable price. It will consume more travel because the cost will go down, because the largest cost that Uber has is the contract labor. Right?
Labor is cost. People don't value their own labor when they drive, though.
Yeah.
So they're treating their own variable costs as close to zero already.
True. Yeah, my only thing was a caution, or just I think we're going to have a massive challenge in the era of autonomous vehicles. The travel will be actually become very, very cheap, which is, on one hand, is a very good thing. On the other hand, is a real mess when it comes to us managing our transportation networks. Other questions? Yeah.
So when you talk about premium service for the bus lines, is it just speed and getting people there quickly, or are there other ways to entice people to get on?
I didn't include that slide in here. I have a slide on that. It is not just speed, right? It is back to that kind of user experience. So, and we had John Martin from Southeastern Institute of Research. And his research is fascinating, right? Because what he says is, sometimes a transit experience begins with that first interaction with the driver. And what people actually remember the most is, how am I treated when I walk up those steps? Is that driver looking at me? Am I having a positive experience? Speed obviously is, I mean, people make all their decisions, a lot of decisions based on speed, but there's also just convenience. So there's a group called the Transit Center out of New York City that's done some very interesting research on this. Even though it's great to have, I love having Wi-Fi on buses, that actually doesn't seem to be right now a big driver. It may be part of that package, right? But just sort of teasing out things like Wi-Fi, and you've seen the little USB cords are dangling from the roof of the New York City buses. It's kind of crazy. It's the engineering solution, put them all on the roof, so it's like dangling their cords off. But those things don't seem to be by themselves to be that much of a sort of changing people's sort of experience and making them sort of kind of want to ride. It's speed, it's convenience, it's cost, right? And then there's that. Then there's sort of those intangibles about, you know, do I feel good about this? Do I feel good about the brand, right? Yeah.
So Mayor Ballard's mayor of this whole county.
Yep.
The entire county.
Yep.
But you described in Denver how he didn't obviously have to go out and spend a lot of time with surrounding mayors of surrounding towns.
Yeah.
And figure out how to
Just 25 council members.
Yeah. So, you know, we have this here where we have multiple cities, multiple communities, and it's probably more like the example used in Denver.
Mm-hmm.
Tell me what some of the tangible benefits are. We really see this sort of transit-oriented development that's come to Denver.
Mm-hmm.
And the further out you get, the harder the case is that this is going to happen, because we already have our own little town center. And what are some of the tangible benefits of the towns and the town centers further out? You know, in this valley it would be Meridian and Eagle and Cuna and Nampa and Caldwell.
Yeah, and I know this has been and is an ongoing debate, right? And it's a lot about how you drew that map, and when you went back to the drawing board after the first loss, how did you redraw that map? So I'm not saying it's perfect. I know that there's folks in, I think, the north of Denver, that's sort of the region that sort of feels like we got nothing out of all this. That said, I think, you know, once you begin to build a network, and again, that I showed you sort of the rail lines, but there are bus feeder lines. There's a hot lane bus rapid transit service up 36 to Boulder. So when you begin to build a network, you know, and this is a true region that people begin to experience, and it sounds kind of silly, but one of the big things that people said is, like, if I can drive the light rail and go to a Rockies game, I'm in. If I can do that like once every 2 months, like that's enough for me. So So there's a regional context, right, within which people, they don't just think about necessarily getting to work every single day. The other thing I would say too is, and it's a little tricky, but you know, we tend to think that we need to have, you know, half the population riding mass transit, and the numbers on congestion, and I know you don't have a ton here, but the numbers on congestion are pretty small. So, you know, every 3% drop in sort of VMT can get a 10% drop in congestion, right? There's a sort of a science to this. You don't have to have transit ridership that is enormous to begin to make a dent in those kind of congestion kinds of things to get people sort of to be mobile. But also in St. Louis, they ran a ballot measure in 2010 to do a sales tax to refund the transit system there. And their campaign was, some of us ride it, all of us need it. And it was all about the people taking care of your elderly parents. It was they had the nurse basically who said, my patients get to this hospital because they use the bus. So it was sort of testimonials about, you know, this really is a critical service. Even if you only use it twice, you know, once every other month, there are people that you know, maybe even your family, or the people who take care of your family or your kids, who actually depend on it. And that really, that was very helpful, I think, in getting people to sort of understand, okay, you're not suggesting that I have to use it every single day. No, actually that's not, success is not defined as that. We do have some sense that everybody should use it all the time and get rid of their car. That's not what we're talking about, right? That's not happening. Other questions? Okay.
Well, I'd like to thank all of you for coming this evening, and thank you, James. He boarded a plane at 6:30 this morning, I believe it was, East Coast time. Flew this morning from DC, so I'm sure he has had a very long, I know he's had a very long day. I'm sure he's quite tired. I'd like to thank you for coming this evening. Also, just a quick reminder to all of you, if you could please fill out your evaluation form and place it in the basket by the back. Also, if you did not sign in when you arrived, please do that as well. The sign-in forms are also next to the back.